Jake Morrison stepped off the transport ship and felt Earth's gravity pull at his tired bones. 3 years of war in space had made him forget how heavy everything felt on his home planet. The air tasted different too, cleaner than the recycled atmosphere he had been breathing on military ships. Around him, other soldiers walked toward the processing center with the same slow, careful steps of people who had seen too much. The spaceport in New Geneva looked nothing like Jake remembered. Half the buildings were new, built from the rubble of the old ones that the Zephyrian bombs had destroyed. The other half still showed scars from the war, with metal patches covering holes in walls and temporary bridges spanning gaps where walkways used to be. People moved through the rebuilt sections with purpose, but their eyes held the same tired look that Jake saw in his own reflection. Jake carried only a small bag with his personal items. Everything else he owned had been lost when his ship took damage during the final battle at Kepler Station. He still remembered the sound of the hull cracking and the way his friend, Danny, had looked at him before the emergency doors sealed between them. Danny never made it to the escape pods. None of the Marines in Section 7 did. The processing line moved slowly. Soldiers ahead of Jake handed over their discharge papers and received small tablets with information about benefits and job placement. Programs. Most of them looked confused, as if they had forgotten what civilian life was supposed to feel like. Jake understood that feeling. He had been fighting aliens for so long that the idea of choosing what to eat for breakfast seemed strange. Jake reached the front of the line. The clerk looked at his papers twice before calling a supervisor. The supervisor, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, came over and spoke quietly to Jake. She told him that General William Cross had left specific instructions in his will. Jake needed to report to the general's estate in the morning. Jake had served under General Cross during the siege of Kepler Station. The general was the kind of leader who remembered every soldier's name and always made sure his people had what they needed. When the Zephyrian fleet surrounded the station, Cross had stayed behind to coordinate the evacuation of civilian refugees. The last transmission from the station had been the general's voice telling all ships to jump to safety while he held the enemy back. The next morning, Jake took a taxi through the rebuilt sections of Geneva. The driver was an older man who talked about how much better things were getting since the war ended. New factories were opening, and trade with the outer colonies was starting again. The man seemed genuinely happy about the peace, but Jake found it hard to share that feeling. Peace meant the fighting was over, but it also meant that all the friends he had lost had died for something that was now just history. The general's estate sat on a hill outside the city. The house was large, but not fancy, built from local stone, with big windows that looked out over the valley below. A woman in a business suit met Jake at the door and introduced herself as the general's lawyer. She led him into a study filled with books and military awards. The lawyer explained that General Cross had updated his will just before the final battle. Most of his property went to various military charities, but there was one unusual bequest. The general had left Jake something that required careful explanation. During the last months of the war, the general had taken custody of a Zephyrian female named Lyra. She had been an intelligence officer who defected to the human side, bringing information that helped end the conflict. When her own people tried to execute her for treason, General Cross had intervened and claimed her under an old Zephyrian honor code. Now that the general was dead, that claim transferred to his chosen heir. Jake felt his stomach drop. The idea of owning another sentient being made him sick, especially one from the species he had been fighting. The lawyer quickly explained that it was more complicated than simple ownership. Lyra had bound herself to the general through ancient Zephyrian customs, and breaking that bond would leave her without identity or purpose. She insisted that the arrangement must continue. The lawyer led Jake to another room where Lyra waited. Jake had never seen a Zephyrian female before. The ones he had fought were always in full armor or environmental suits. Lyra was tall and graceful, with blue skin that seemed to glow softly in the afternoon light. Her silver hair moved as if it had a life of its own, and her eyes were the color of distant stars. She was beautiful in a way that made Jake uncomfortable, because he had spent years training himself to see her people as the enemy. Lyra stood when Jake entered and spoke in accented but clear English. She told him that her life belonged to him now, just as it had belonged to General Cross. The debt of honor could only be repaid through service, and she would serve Jake until her death or his released her. Her voice was calm and dignified, but Jake could see something in her eyes that might have been fear or sadness. Jake tried to tell her that he didn't want to own anyone, that she was free to go wherever she wanted. Lyra shook her head and explained that freedom without honor was worse than death for her people. If Jake rejected her service, she would become nothing, a being without purpose or place in the universe. She asked only that he allow her to fulfill her obligation. The lawyer gave Jake papers to sign and explained that Lyra would need documentation to live on Earth. As far as the government was concerned, she was a refugee under Jake's sponsorship. The reality of the Zephyrian honor codes was something the human legal system didn't really understand. Jake signed the papers because he didn't know what else to do. Lyra thanked him formally and gathered her few possessions. As they left the estate together, Jake wondered how he was supposed to live with someone from the species that had killed his friends. He also wondered what General Cross had been thinking when he made this arrangement. The taxi ride back to the city was quiet. Lyra sat perfectly still and looked out the window at the passing landscape. Jake studied her profile and tried to reconcile this calm, dignified person with the savage aliens he had fought in space. She didn't look like a killer, but then again, neither did he. Jake's apartment in Detroit was small and simple, just 2 rooms and a kitchen in one of the rebuilt housing blocks. He had lived there alone since coming back from the war, and now he had to figure out how to share the space with someone who used to be his enemy. Lyra looked around the apartment without comment and asked which corner she could use for sleeping. The question caught Jake off guard. He told her she could use the bedroom while he took the couch, but Lyra shook her head. She explained that servants did not sleep in their master's bed, and that a corner of the main room would be more than adequate for her needs. Jake tried to argue, but Lyra was firm about what she saw as proper behavior. The first few days were awkward in ways Jake had never experienced. Lyra cleaned the apartment, prepared meals, and tried to anticipate his needs before he even knew what they were. She was quiet and efficient, moving through the small space like a ghost. When Jake tried to start conversations, her answers were polite but brief. She called him sir and asked permission before using anything in the apartment the neighbors were not happy about Lyra's presence. Mrs. Patterson from next door made loud comments about aliens in the hallway. Mr. Chun from downstairs started locking his door whenever he heard footsteps in the building. The building manager, a veteran named Pete, who had lost his left arm in the war, came by to warn Jake that some residents were talking about filing complaints. Jake tried to explain to Lyra that she didn't need to act like a servant, that she could make herself at home and do whatever she wanted. Lyra listened politely and then continued doing exactly what she had been doing before. She seemed to believe that any change in her behavior would be inappropriate. The situation started to change when Jake got a call from his reserve unit commander. Pirates had attacked a refugee transport carrying Zephyrian civilians near the Jupiter mining stations. The transport was damaged and drifting, and rescue ships were having trouble approaching because of the pirates' defensive positions. Jake's experience with space combat made him valuable for the rescue operation. Jake was getting ready to leave when Lyra asked if she could come with him. She explained that she knew Zephyrian ship designs and might be able to help with the rescue. Jake's first instinct was to say no, but something in her voice made him reconsider. For the first time since he had met her, Lyra sounded like she wanted to do something instead of just following orders. The rescue ship was a converted cargo hauler with basic weapons and shields. Jake joined the tactical team, while Lyra worked with the ship's technical crew. When they reached the disaster site, they found the refugee transport surrounded by 3 pirate vessels. The pirates were demanding payment for safe passage, but the refugees had nothing valuable except their lives. Jake studied the tactical display and felt frustrated. The pirates had positioned themselves well, and any direct assault would put the refugees at risk. The transport's hull was already cracked, and weapons fire near it could cause complete structural failure. Traditional rescue tactics were not going to work. Lyra approached Jake during the planning session and offered information about the transport's design. She explained that Zephyrian ships had emergency systems that could be activated remotely if someone knew the right codes. She also knew about weaknesses in the pirate ships, configurations that the human tactical computers had missed working together. Jake and Lyra developed a plan that used the transport's own systems against the pirates. Lyra would hack into the transport's emergency beacon and modify it to interfere with the pirates' communications. At the same time, Jake would coordinate an attack that targeted the pirates' sensor arrays rather than their weapons. Blind and unable to communicate, the pirates would have to choose between fighting in confusion or retreating. The plan worked better than Jake had expected. The pirates' ships lost coordination within minutes of the attack beginning. 2 of them fled immediately, while the third tried to fight but couldn't target effectively without sensors. The rescue ships were able to approach the transport and begin evacuating refugees without a single casualty. During the evacuation, Jake watched Lyra working with the Zephyrian refugees. She moved among them speaking in her own language, calming frightened children and helping injured adults. Her whole demeanor changed when she was with her own people. She seemed more alive, more like a real person instead of the quiet servant who lived in his apartment. One of the refugee children, a small girl with burn marks on her arm, clung to Lyra and wouldn't let go. Lyra held the child gently and sang something in Zephyrian that made the girl stop crying. Jake found himself watching this scene and feeling confused about his own emotions. The woman comforting the child didn't look like an enemy. She looked like someone who understood suffering and wanted to help. After the evacuation was complete, the rescue ship's captain thanked Jake and Lyra for their assistance. He said that without Lyra's knowledge of Zephyrian systems, the operation would have taken much longer and might have resulted in deaths. Other crew members who had been suspicious of Lyra began treating her with respect. On the trip back to Earth, Jake and Lyra talked for the first time as equals instead of master and servant. Jake asked her about the song she had sung to the child, and Lyra explained that it was a traditional lullaby about finding safety in dark places. She told him that many Zephyrian children were now orphans because of the war, and that seeing them brought back memories of her own lost family. Jake found himself sharing his own experiences, including the death of his friend Danny during the battle at Kepler Station. He told Lyra about the guilt he felt for surviving when so many others hadn't, and about the difficulty of adjusting to peace after years of fighting. Lyra listened without judgment and said that survivors' guilt was common among her people too. When they returned to the apartment, something had changed between them. Lyra still insisted on maintaining proper behavior, but she was willing to have conversations and even ask Jake questions about human customs. Jake began to see her as a person with her own thoughts and feelings, rather than just a responsibility he had inherited. The neighbors' attitudes started to change too after. News of the rescue operation spread through the building. Pete, the building manager, stopped by to tell Jake that he was proud of both of them for helping people regardless of species. Mrs. Patterson brought soup one day and actually smiled at Lyra. The apartment building began to feel less hostile. Jake realized that his assumptions about Zephyrians had been based on fighting their soldiers in wartime. Lyra was showing him that her people were capable of the same compassion and courage that humans valued. At the same time, Lyra was learning that not all humans were the brutal warriors she had seen during the conflict. They were both discovering that their enemies had been more human than either side had wanted to admit. Over the following weeks, Jake and Lyra were called to help with several more peacekeeping missions. The success of the refugee rescue had made them valuable to the authorities, who were trying to maintain stability between humans and Zephyrians. Each mission brought them closer together as partners and helped them understand each other better. During quiet evenings in the apartment, they began sharing stories about their lives before the war. Lyra told Jake about growing up on Zephyr Prime, where she had studied human culture as an academic curiosity. She had been fascinated by human art and literature, especially the way humans wrote about love and friendship across different groups. Her interest in human society had made her unpopular with other Zephyrians, who saw such studies as weakness. Jake talked about his childhood in Michigan, where his younger brother Danny had followed him everywhere and dreamed of joining the space Marines. He described fishing trips with their father and the way Danny used to practice military drills in their backyard. When the Zephyrians attacked Luna City, Danny had been visiting friends there for his birthday. Jake had learned about his brothers' death through an official casualty report 3 days later. Lyra listened to these stories with genuine sadness in her eyes. She told Jake that her own younger sister had died when human forces bombed a civilian area on her home world. The attack had been a mistake, targeting what intelligence reported as a military facility that turned out to be a school. Lyra had been serving in the Zephyrian fleet when it happened, and the news had started her questioning whether the war made any sense. These conversations helped both of them understand that the war had created similar losses and pain for families on both sides. They began to see their partnership as something more than just duty or convenience. They were two people who had survived terrible experiences and could help each other heal. Their growing friendship was tested when reports came in about attacks on Zephyrian refugees in the settlement camps outside Chicago. A group calling itself Human Defense Force was targeting alien families with raids and bombings. The attacks were carefully planned and executed with military precision, suggesting that former soldiers were involved. Jake was assigned to investigate the attacks along with other reserve officers. When he mentioned the assignment to Lyra, she asked to come with him. She pointed out that the attackers might be more willing to reveal their plans around her, thinking she was just Jake's servant. Jake was reluctant to put her in danger, but Lyra insisted that stopping the attacks was more important than her safety. The refugee camp was a collection of temporary buildings, surrounded by a basic security fence. Families lived in small prefabricated units that were meant to be temporary, but had become permanent homes for people who had nowhere else to go. Children played in the narrow spaces between buildings, while adults tried to find work or learn English from volunteer teachers. Jake and Lyra interviewed families who had been targeted in the attacks. The stories were all similar. Masked humans in military gear would surround a family unit at night, smash windows, and leave threatening messages telling the aliens to leave Earth. No one had been killed yet, but several people had been injured by broken glass and debris. What worried Jake most was how well organized the attacks seemed to be. The attackers knew which families had no male adults present and which units were farthest from the security guards. They came prepared with tools for cutting through fences and devices for jamming the camp's communication systems. This was not random violence, but planned intimidation. On their third day at the camp, Jake recognized one of the security guards as Ryan Blake. a former Marine who had served in Jake's unit during the war. Ryan had been a good soldier, but had become increasingly bitter after losing several friends in the final battles. When Jake approached him, Ryan seemed nervous and avoided making eye contact. That evening, Jake and Lyra were walking back to their temporary quarters when they heard explosions from the family housing area. Emergency lights came on as people ran from their units in panic. Jake could see flames coming from several buildings and hear children crying in the darkness as they rushed toward the burning buildings. Jake saw figures in dark clothing moving through the camp. The attackers were using military tactics, moving in coordinated teams and covering each other's movements. Jake pulled out his service weapon and told Lyra to stay back, but she followed him anyway. The attackers had cornered a Zephyrian family in one of the burning units. Jake could see a woman holding 2 small children, while a man tried to shield them from the flames. The attackers were shouting demands for the family to leave Earth and return to their own world, apparently not caring that the Zephyrian homeworlds had been devastated by the war. Jake called out for the attackers to stop and identified himself as a reserve officer. Instead of surrendering, the attackers turned their weapons toward him. In the firefight that followed, Lyra used her knowledge of military tactics to help Jake outmaneuver the attackers. She guided him through the camp's layout while he coordinated with other security personnel over his radio. During the fight, Jake was shocked to see Ryan Blake among the attackers. His former squadmate was wearing the same dark gear as the others and carrying military-grade weapons. When Ryan saw Jake, he shouted accusations about betrayal and collaboration with the enemy. He claimed that Jake had forgotten his duty to humanity by working with aliens. The confrontation forced Jake to make a choice between his old loyalties and his new understanding. He could let Ryan and the others escape, or he could treat them as criminals who were threatening innocent people. Looking at the terrified Zephyrian family and remembering all the conversations he had shared with Lyra, Jake made his decision. Working together, Jake and Lyra managed to surround Ryan's group and force them to surrender. The tactics they used combined human military training with Zephyrian strategic thinking, creating approaches that neither species would have developed alone. Other security personnel were amazed at how effectively the partnership worked. After the attackers were arrested, Jake learned that Ryan had been recruiting former soldiers who felt abandoned by the peace process. They believed that working with Zephyrians was a betrayal of everyone who had died in the war. Ryan told Jake that he was disappointed in him for choosing aliens over his own species. Jake tried to explain that he wasn't choosing sides, but trying to prevent more unnecessary suffering. He told Ryan about the conversations he had shared with Lyra and the things he had learned about Zephyrian culture. Ryan listened, but seemed unable to accept that former enemies could become anything other than threats. Investigation that followed revealed that the attacks were part of a larger pattern happening across Earth. Someone was organizing former soldiers and supplying them with weapons and intelligence about refugee camps. The goal seemed to be reigniting conflict between humans and Zephyrians by making peaceful coexistence impossible. As Jake and Lyra prepared to return to Detroit, they realized that their partnership had become something more than either of them had expected. They were no longer master and servant, or even just friends. They had become a team that could accomplish things neither could do alone. The trust between them had grown strong enough to survive combat and the test of choosing each other over old loyalties. The investigation into the refugee camp attacks led Jake and Lyra deeper into a web of conspiracy that reached much higher than angry former soldiers. The weapons used by Ryan Blake's group were military grade and should have been impossible for civilians to obtain. The intelligence about camp security and family locations was too detailed to have come from casual observation. Jake's commanding officer, Colonel Harris, assigned them to work with federal investigators who were tracking the source of the weapons. The trail led to several missing shipments from decommissioned military bases and black market dealers operating in the outer colonies. Someone with high-level access was systematically supplying extremist groups on both sides of the former conflict. Their investigation, Lyra revealed information that she had been reluctant to share before. She told Jake that before her defection, she had served under a Zephyrian commander named Vextar who had disappeared during the final battle. Official records listed him as dead, but Lyra had always suspected that he had abandoned his post rather than face defeat. Vextar had been a brilliant strategist, but had also believed that Zephyrians were naturally superior to humans and that peace would make both species weak. Jake shared his own suspicions about Admiral Marcus Stone, a human fleet commander who had supposedly died heroically in the same battle where General Cross had made his final stand. Stone had been known for his aggressive tactics and his belief that humans needed constant conflict to remain strong. Several Marines had reported seeing Stone's escape pod launch before his ship exploded, but official investigations had concluded that the pod had been destroyed. Working together, Jake and Lyra began to piece together a pattern that suggested both Vextar and Stone might still be alive and working together. The attacks on refugees seemed designed to restart hostilities between the species, and the weapons being supplied to extremist groups came from both human and Zephyrian sources. Someone was playing both sides against each other. Their investigation led them to intercepted communications mentioning something called the Titan Project. References to the project appeared in messages between different extremist cells, but the details were coded in ways that neither human nor Zephyrian intelligence could fully decode. Lyra recognized some of the Zephyrian code phrases as military terminology that only high-ranking officers would know. The breakthrough came when they discovered that someone had been accessing the abandoned Titan research station in the outer system. The station had been used for joint human-Zephyrian scientific projects before the war, and had been evacuated when hostilities began. Recent sensor readings showed ships docking at the station and movement in sections that should have been empty. Colonel Harris authorized a reconnaissance mission to investigate the station. Jake and Lyra joined a small team aboard a stealth ship designed to approach without being detected. As they got closer to Titan Station, they could see that it had been heavily modified with new defensive systems and weapon emplacements. Someone had turned the research facility into a military base. Long-range sensors detected multiple ships docked at the station, including vessels of both human and Zephyrian design. The ships bore no official markings, but their configurations matched those used by the extremist groups that had been attacking refugee settlements. Jake realized they had found the source of the conspiracy. The team managed to infiltrate the station through a maintenance airlock that had been overlooked during the security upgrades. Moving through the corridors, they found evidence of a massive operation. Storage bays contained weapons and supplies that could outfit a small army. Communication centers showed evidence of coordinating attacks across multiple star systems. In what had once been the station's main laboratory, Jake and Lyra discovered something that made their blood run cold. The conspirators were preparing to stage a massive false flag attack on a joint research facility where human and Zephyrian scientists were working together on peaceful projects. The attack would be designed to look like each species had betrayed the other, guaranteeing that the peace process would collapse. The plan was sophisticated and cruel. Explosives would be placed to make it appear that humans had sabotaged Zephyrian equipment, while simultaneously making it look like Zephyrians had targeted human personnel. Evidence would be planted to suggest that both sides had been secretly preparing for renewed war. The attack would kill innocent scientists and destroy years of cooperation. As they gathered evidence of the plot, Jake and Lyra were discovered by security guards. In the chase that followed, they became separated in the station's maze of corridors. Jake found himself cornered in a storage bay, where he came face to face with Admiral Marcus Stone. Stone looked older and more bitter than Jake remembered from wartime briefings. He explained that he had faked his death because he believed the peace negotiations were a betrayal of everyone who had died in the war. He claimed that both humans and Zephyrians were naturally warriors who needed conflict to remain strong. Peace would make them soft and vulnerable to other threats in the galaxy. Stone offered Jake a chance to join the conspiracy, arguing that Jake's experience with combat proved that he understood the value of strength. He claimed that the false flag operation would ultimately save both species by preventing them from growing weak through cooperation. Jake listened to the arguments while looking for a way to escape and warn the others. Meanwhile, Lyra had found herself in the command center where she encountered Vexstar, her former commander. The Zephyrian looked at her with a mixture of disappointment and contempt. He told her that her defection had been a sign of the weakness that was infecting both species. He offered her a chance to redeem herself by killing Jake and helping to restart the war. Vexstar argued that the false flag attack would restore proper thinking to both species by reminding them that cooperation with aliens was impossible. He claimed that Lyra's time with humans had confused her about her true nature as a Zephyrian warrior. He promised that if she helped with the operation, she could return to Zephyrian society with honor. Lyra found herself thinking about everything she had learned since General Cross had saved her life. She thought about the refugee children she had comforted and the way Jake had trusted her in combat. She remembered the conversations they had shared about loss and healing, and the way they had worked together to protect innocent people. When Vexstar demanded her answer, Lyra told him that honor came from protecting others, not from causing suffering. She said that her time with humans had taught her that strength came from choosing compassion over hatred. She refused to help restart a war that had already caused too much pain. The confrontation escalated when both Jake and Lyra tried to escape with the evidence they had gathered. The station's security systems were activated, trapping them in a maze of sealed corridors, while Stone and Vexstar coordinated their capture. Emergency lights flashed as automated defenses came online, turning their escape attempt into a deadly game of cat and mouse. Jake and Lyra managed to reunite in the station's communication center, where they realized they had only one chance to stop the false flag attack. They would have to risk everything by sending a warning to both human and Zephyrian authorities while fighting their way through the station's defenses. The success of their mission would determine whether peace between the species could survive. Jake and Lyra worked frantically in the communication center as alarms blared throughout Titan Station. They had managed to access the main transmitter, but Stone and Vexstar security forces were closing in on their position. Lyra used her knowledge of Zephyrian technology to boost the signal strength, while Jake coordinated with the backup systems to reach both human and alien authorities. The message they sent contained all the evidence they had gathered about the false flag operation, including detailed plans and the location of the target facility. They also transmitted the identities of the conspirators and proof that extremist attacks on both sides were being coordinated from Titan Station. The transmission would take several minutes to reach the nearest relay stations, and they had to hold their position until it was complete. Stone's forces attacked the communication center with military precision, using weapons that could penetrate the station's bulkheads. Jake and Lyra found themselves fighting a defensive battle against overwhelming odds. They used the equipment in the center as cover while returning fire and trying to protect the transmitter array. During the battle, an explosion damaged part of the ceiling above them. Lyra saw the debris falling toward Jake and threw herself between him and the falling metal. The impact knocked her unconscious and left her badly injured with cuts and burns across her arms and face. Jake pulled her to safety behind a bank of computers while continuing to defend their position. as Jake tended to Lyra's wounds. She regained consciousness and told him that her honor debt to General Cross was finally paid. She had now saved Jake's life just as the general had saved hers, completing the circle of obligation that had bound her to his service. She said that she was free to choose her own path for the first time since her defection. Jake realized that his feelings for Lyra had grown beyond friendship into something deeper. He had come to love her strength, her compassion, and the way she had helped him see past the hatred that the war had created. But he was afraid that her cultural programming and their history made it impossible for her to consent freely to any relationship with him. Lyra seemed to understand his thoughts without him having to speak them. She explained that Zephyrian honor bonds could transform into partnership bonds when both parties chose freely and equally. She told Jake that she had come to love him not from obligation, but from respect for his character and the way he had grown during their time together. Conversation was interrupted when reinforcements from their reconnaissance team arrived to help them escape. The backup team had received their transmission and coordinated with approaching human and Zephyrian ships to surround the station. Stone and Vextar's forces found themselves trapped with no way to retreat. In the final confrontation, Stone made one last attempt to convince Jake that peace would destroy humanity's warrior spirit. He argued that conflict with aliens was natural and necessary, and that cooperation would lead to weakness and eventual conquest by other galactic powers. Jake listened to the arguments, but found that they no longer made sense to him. Jake told Stone that the war had taught him that strength came from protecting others, not from conquering them. He said that his partnership with Lyra had shown him possibilities that neither species could achieve alone. Working together, humans and Zephyrians could solve problems and face challenges that would defeat either group separately. Vextar made a similar final appeal to Lyra, claiming that her loyalty to Jake represented a betrayal of her own species. He argued that Zephyrians were naturally superior to humans, and that mixing their cultures would pollute the purity of both races. Lyra rejected these arguments with the same conviction that Jake had shown. Lyra told Vextar that her time with humans had taught her that diversity created strength rather than weakness. She said that the best aspects of Zephyrian culture, including their concepts of honor and service, could be combined with human creativity and adaptability to create something better than either species had achieved alone. The arrest of Stone and Vextar led to the exposure of their entire network of conspirators and extremist cells. Evidence from Titan Station helped authorities on both sides identify and capture dozens of people who had been working to restart the war. The false flag attack was prevented, and the Joint Research Facility continued its work on peaceful cooperation. Jake and Lyra were offered positions as liaisons in the newly formed Interspecies Cooperation Council, helping to build understanding between former enemies. They accepted the roles and began developing training programs for mixed human-Zephyrian peacekeeping teams. Their success in working together became a model for other partnerships between the species. The work was not easy. Both species had members who remained suspicious of the other, and there were cultural differences that required patience and understanding to overcome. But Jake and Lyra had learned that trust could be built even between former enemies when people chose to see past fear and prejudice. Their personal relationship continued to grow alongside their professional partnership. They moved to a larger apartment that could serve as both a home and a meeting place for the mixed teams they were training. The neighborhood that had once been hostile to Lyra's presence became a community where human and Zephyrian families lived and worked together. Jake often thought about General Cross and wondered if the general had foreseen how the arrangement would develop. By bringing Jake and Lyra together, Cross had created more than just a way to honor Zephyrian customs. He had created a bridge between two species that had been taught to hate each other. The training program they developed became a template for Cooperation throughout the galaxy. Teams of humans and Zephyrians worked together on exploration missions, disaster relief operations, and peacekeeping efforts in systems where other species were experiencing conflicts. Their success proved that former enemies could become partners when they chose to focus on shared goals rather than past grievances. One evening, as they watched new recruits from both species training together in their facility, Lyra told Jake that Zephyrian language had no direct word for hope. The closest concept meant tomorrow's possibilities, reflecting the way her people thought about the future as something that could be shaped by present choices. Jake responded that humans had learned that the best possibilities arose when different perspectives combined their strengths. He said that their partnership represented not just personal love, but a template for the galaxy's future, one built on chosen bonds rather than imposed divisions. Looking at the mixed teams working together in the training facility, Jake and Lyra could see evidence that peace was more than just the absence of war. Real peace required the hard work of building understanding across differences and choosing cooperation over conflict. They had become living proof that even the deepest hatreds could be transformed into lasting friendship and love. The war was over, but the work of building a better future was just beginning. Jake and Lyra faced that future together, knowing that they had helped create something that neither of their species could have achieved alone. They had found in each other not just love but hope for a galaxy where diversity created strength rather than division.